My name is Edward, and there are moments in a man's life when the weight of his years presses down so heavily that even the simplest breath feels like carrying a mountain. I thought I had endured every pain life could give me. I thought the betrayals of business partners, the silence of a house once filled with family, and the loneliness of age had already carved every wound my heart could take. But nothing compared to the day I saw my grandson huddled under a bridge, holding his baby in his arms like a fragile secret against the cold. The image seared itself into me, sharper than any knife. He was thin, his face pale, and his clothes torn as if the world had already tried to erase him. And that child, my great-grandchild, swaddled in a blanket, so thin it was more holes than fabric. I stood frozen as the sound of cars thundered above us, drowning the silence of my soul. How had it come to this? How had blood of my blood fallen so far that the streets claimed him instead of a home? My chest ached as I watched them, hidden in the shadow of that bridge, and for a moment I felt older than time itself. Before we continue to the story, please subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments what you think will happen next. I had not spoken to my grandson in years. There had been arguments, the kind that leave scars deeper than fists. His parents had turned their backs on him when he chose love over wealth, when he refused to marry the woman they picked and instead followed his heart. I stayed silent then, a cowardly silence I regret every day, because I thought perhaps they were right. Perhaps he would come crawling back and beg for the fortune waiting for him. But seeing him there proved how wrong I had been. He had not crawled back. He had fallen, and no one had reached to catch him. Until now. I walked toward him, my cane echoing softly against the pavement. He didn't notice me at first. His eyes were fixed on the baby, whispering words I could not hear. When he finally looked up, his eyes widened with disbelief. "Grandfather," he breathed, his voice cracking like brittle glass. He looked ashamed, as if my presence was a mirror reflecting all he had lost. For a moment we just stared at each other. Time had changed him from the boy who used to chase fireflies in my garden into a man broken by the world. I said nothing at first. My hand trembled as I reached forward and touched the child's blanket. Cold. The baby stirred, and I saw tiny fingers curling in the air, searching for warmth. That was the moment something inside me hardened into steel. No child of mine, no descendant of mine, would ever know this kind of hunger and cold. Not while I drew breath. I told him, "Come with me." He shook his head at once, pride flashing in his tired eyes. "I can't. Your family doesn't want me. They said I was dead to them, and maybe I am." His words hit me like a hammer. My family, my blood, my legacy, and I had let them banish him while I stood idle, wrapped in my fortune and my pride. "You are not dead to me," I said. "Get up. Bring the baby. We are going home." He stared at me, torn between pride and desperation, until the baby whimpered again and his resolve crumbled. He rose slowly, cradling the child close, and together we stepped out from the shadows of that bridge. The world above was busy and indifferent, cars rushing past, people walking with umbrellas against the drizzle, never glancing down at the forgotten souls below. But I knew in my heart this was no ordinary walk. This was the beginning of a war. I had lived long enough to know that money is both a shield and a weapon, and I had more of it than most nations. But I also knew money could not fix what had been broken in my grandson's heart. Trust had been shattered, family bonds severed. I would have to mend those myself. Yet first, I would do what I did best. I would use my wealth to strike fear into those who had abandoned him, those who had forced him to sleep on the cold earth while they dined under chandeliers. They thought him weak. They thought me finished. They were about to learn the cost of their cruelty. At the airport my jet awaited, polished silver against the gray sky. My staff looked shocked to see me arrive with two ragged figures, but not one dared to question. I had built an empire by commanding silence and obedience, and even in my old age that aura remained. We boarded quietly, and as the engines roared to life, I watched my grandson sink into the leather seat, his baby pressed against his chest. He looked like a man tasting warmth for the first time in years. I offered him food, clothes, and blankets, but he refused politely until hunger forced him to take small bites. I said nothing. I knew pride when I saw it. I had lived with it my whole life. As the jet cut through the clouds, I leaned back and stared out at the endless sky. My heart pounded with anger at the thought of those who had done this to him. My own children, his parents, who had chosen wealth over blood. They had inherited my ruthlessness, but not my compassion. They had forgotten what it meant to be human. They had forgotten me. But I would remind them, with my grandson at my side and the proof of his innocence wrapped in that small, fragile child. I would show them what true power was, and I would take from them the one thing they valued most. The jet descended toward my estate, a sprawling mansion perched on the cliffs overlooking the ocean. Lights flickered on as we approached, servants rushing to prepare for my arrival. For decades this house had been my fortress, my crown. But tonight it would become a battlefield. I looked at my grandson and whispered, "Welcome home." He stared at me in silence, torn between gratitude and suspicion. And I knew this was only the beginning. The estate looked exactly as I remembered it, but colder somehow. As the car rolled down the driveway lined with towering pines, the lights from the mansion glowed like watchful eyes, waiting for me to step inside and remind them who truly owned this kingdom. My grandson sat beside me, silent, his baby asleep against his chest. I could see the fear in his posture. He had grown used to shadows and hunger. Comfort felt like a trap to him now. I reached across and rested my hand gently on his shoulder. "You are safe here." But the truth was I was not so certain. When the front doors opened, my eldest son stood there. His face froze when he saw who I had brought. Behind him, his wife clutched her pearls and gasped as though I had dragged a ghost into her perfect home. "Father," my son said stiffly, his voice carrying the sharp edge of anger. "What is this? Why is he here?" I stepped out slowly, cane tapping against the marble. "He is here because he is blood. He is here because I say so." The silence that followed was heavy. My grandson shifted uneasily, his eyes darting like a cornered animal. My daughter-in-law sneered. "That boy abandoned us. He chose to disgrace this family. And now you bring him back under our roof. He will poison everything." My jaw tightened. Poison. The word tasted foul. I looked at her directly and spoke with a calmness I did not feel. "The only poison in this family is the arrogance that lets a mother turn her back on her own child." Her face flushed red, but she said nothing more. We were shown into the grand hall. The baby stirred at the sudden brightness and began to cry softly. My grandson tried to soothe him, rocking back and forth with desperate tenderness. I watched the servants glance at one another, whispers blooming like weeds in a garden. The sight of their fallen heir returning with a child born of love and not arranged alliances would spread like wildfire, and I would make sure it burned the right people. At dinner the tension thickened like smoke. My son sat stiff, refusing to meet his child's eyes. His wife kept her gaze fixed on me, as if she could stare me into submission. I ate slowly, listening, waiting. Finally my son spoke. "Father, this is a mistake. He made his choice long ago. He is not one of us anymore. Why risk everything you have built for him?" His words cut deep. For years he had seen my fortune as his inheritance, my empire as his birthright. Now he feared its balance shifting. I looked at him and said, "Because he is family. And you seem to have forgotten what that means." The room went still. My grandson lowered his gaze, torn between gratitude and pain. I could see his pride battling his need for acceptance. And I hated my son in that moment for forcing him into such torment. After dinner, I walked with my grandson through the corridors of the mansion. His footsteps echoed, hesitant, as though each step might trigger some hidden trap. He whispered, "I don't belong here. They will never accept me." I stopped and turned to him. "You belong here more than anyone. You carry the truth they have long abandoned. Do not let them drive you away." His eyes glistened, but he said nothing more. That night I could not sleep. I paced my study, staring at the portraits of ancestors who seemed to watch me with judgment. I had built everything for my children, only to see them twisted into chains of greed. They believed money was their shield, but I knew better. Wealth without love is nothing but rot dressed in gold. My grandson had suffered because I had been silent for too long. Now silence was no longer an option. The next morning my daughter arrived. She walked into the room with the air of someone certain of her power. When she saw her nephew, Her lips curled into a cold smile. "I should have known you'd crawl back," she said, begging for scraps. My grandson stiffened, but I stepped between them. He did not crawl back. I brought him, and you will treat him with respect. She laughed, a brittle sound that scraped against my nerves. Respect. For him. He's nothing. He's poor, disgraced, and now he's dragging some bastard child into this family's name. The word slammed into me with the force of a storm. I saw my grandson flinch, clutching the baby tighter, as though shielding him from daggers. My blood boiled, but I held my voice steady. "Be careful," I warned, "for the stones you throw may fall upon your own head." She waved a dismissive hand and turned away, but her words had already carved themselves into my soul. They called him poor. They spat on the innocence of his child, and they did it in my house, beneath my roof, beneath the empire I had built. That evening I made my decision. If they valued wealth more than blood, then wealth would be the weapon I used to destroy them. I summoned my lawyer and began drawing papers. A transfer of power, a shift in inheritance. My empire, my billions, my properties across the world, they would no longer pass to the children who had spat on my name. They would go instead to the one who had been abandoned yet endured, my grandson, and the child he carried. I watched my grandson as he slept on the couch, the baby nestled against him. His face was peaceful in that moment, stripped of shame and pain. He was not a failure. He was not weak. He was a father, fighting in silence for his child's survival. And I would fight with him. For both of them. But revenge, I knew, must be careful. It must be patient. To strike too soon would only harden their cruelty. I would wait until they revealed themselves fully, until their greed rotted them from within. And then I would show them the cost of forgetting what it means to be a family. For now, I would keep my secret close. Let them sneer. Let them whisper. Let them believe he was still nothing. Because when the truth was revealed, it would shatter them. And I would be there to watch every piece fall. The morning after I signed the first set of papers, I felt both lighter and infinitely more watchful. I had instructed my lawyer to draft a new set of wills and trusts that would reroute the greatest portion of my fortune away from the children who had shown contempt and toward the two who had been cast out and the charities that protected those in need. I did it quietly, deliberately, using clauses that would only come into force upon my explicit instruction, and I left hints in safe places for people who had always honored me to find should anything go wrong. I also began to place small, careful bets designed not to enrich me, but to expose their appetites, moving minor assets into very visible ventures under my grandson's name while making sure the tax filings, corporate minutes, and public notices bore the mark of his stewardship. I watched them rage and laugh, thinking themselves clever as they sniffed success in the air, unaware their victory was being built on a stage I had set. I cultivated allies too, the kind of people who do not care for gossip, but care for reputation, for integrity, for the quiet arithmetic of power. A banker who had owed me for a favor agreed to keep an eye on sudden withdrawals. A trusted board member promised to escalate any attempts to siphon funds. My grandson learned how to sign checks and answer the phone, and each time he stepped into a room and introduced himself as manager, people looked up. Their sneers began to crack because authority, even when made from the humblest start, commands attention. I started small public acts that would sting in ways money could not explain. I donated an evening's worth of my art collection to the museum under my grandson's name and ensured the press release mentioned his story, how he had found his child under a bridge, and how he had taken immediate steps to provide refuge for others in similar plight. I underwrote a scholarship for young parents and publicly asked my children to join me in the naming ceremony. Their faces twitched. Propriety and greed warred in them, and pride lost ground. I could see in my eldest son the particular look of a man who measures his worth only by how the world applauds him, and applause now leaned elsewhere. Then I began to move more deliberately, using my legal muscle in ways that forced them to show exactly what they were made of. I placed a conditional clause on a holding company that required unanimous familial approval for any major disposition, and then I left the agenda for the next family council unreadable to them until the moment came. Their assumption that inheritance would flow like a river into their hands made them careless. Carelessness in the presence of a patient mind is a dangerous sin. There were nights when my grandson would sit quietly by the study fire, the child in a blanket at his feet, and he would ask if I truly meant to uproot the life my children had planned. He feared shame would follow the family name. He worried guilt would become their armor. I told him that shame weighed nothing compared to survival and dignity, that sometimes to save what is good you must burn what is rotten. He would look at me with an expression that was part terror and part relief, and I knew he understood the cost we might pay, but also the cost they would already have paid should we remain mute. He began to speak at small gatherings, at civic lunches, with a voice that grew steadier, and people who did not know him now heard stories not of scandal but of rescue, of small acts that become large when done in the right light. The men who had once turned their noses up now found themselves listening, asked for advice, asked for introductions, and the slips they thought they had placed beneath their cushions began to show. Then the night came when I decided the first public test would occur. My daughter had organized a charity gala, as elegant and social as she could make it, filled with the right kind of guests who liked to see themselves on the important side of good works. I allowed it to proceed, offering the venue and the catering as a kind of bait, and I made sure the board members were seated in places where hearing the truth could not be avoided. I called my eldest son and told him I would attend with a small speech about community responsibility. He exhibited that same brittle smile people wear when they think they are safe. How naive he was! When the evening arrived and the chandeliers bathed the room in forgiving light, I waited until people had eaten and the speeches began. I watched my children speak in polished platitudes about service and about family legacy, while my grandson sat quietly, cradling a sleeping child. When it was my turn, I stepped into the light and did not praise them. I praised him. I told the room about a boy who had slept under a bridge, whose child could have been taken from the world by cold and indifference if no one dared reach. I recounted how he had chosen to lift that child with nothing but bare hands and stubborn love. The clinking of silver stopped like rain when the wind dies. I named the trust one had created in simple language, and explained that the assets would empower young parents and house those who had nowhere to go. I explained that the trustees would be people chosen for character, not blood. I passed the microphone to my grandson, and he stood, trembling but honest, and spoke of a night where pride had been a poison and mercy the only antidote. Cameras turned, not to the children who had spurned him, but to him. My eldest son's face went white. He tried to laugh it off afterwards, to say this was a momentary excess, but the damage had been done. The guests began to speak not of property lines or stock portfolios, but of the work the trust would do. Invitations to sit on boards arrived at my grandson's table within weeks. Donors who had once sent their funds to my eldest son's causes started asking why he had not been involved in outreach at the level my grandson now represented. Power shifted not because I had handed it conveniently, but because I had given it meaning. And meaning is harder to counterfeit than a signature. They attempted retaliation in small ways at first, petty measures to make life uncomfortable, a call to the press hinting at impropriety, a letter from a supposed creditor reminding us that even the best intentions must account for cost. I had foreseen this and prepared. My legal team released audited records showing all donations and expenditures, transparent and clear, and the men who had tried to smear us found that dirt often shines when you try to rub it into someone else's face. Their attacks only pulled back the curtain further and revealed not charity but calculation. The relatives who had once lined up to take a slice of my empire found themselves questioned about their own accounts. My eldest son's board members began to distance themselves. His wife took to avoiding public gatherings where our names might be mentioned together. Pride is a brittle mask. When it cracks, it exposes everything beneath. There were moments when I saw my son in the hall and recognized a look I had carried for years, that hard, hungry man who once closed his fist around a deal and forgot the hands that fed him. I pitied him, in a way older men pity the weathered and whoever forgot to bring an umbrella. But pity does not stop consequence. I had planned not to ruin them for sport, but to remind them of their duty. The trust would stand as a living rebuke to their cruelty and as a beacon for those who had been left behind. By the time the legal transfers were final, the family had fractured along lines that money cannot heal quickly. My grandson and the child he held became a quiet force, a story of redemption that slowly changed the town's conversation about compassion. My son's prestige dimmed while my grandson's credibility grew. The revenge, if it could be called that, was not thunderous. It was the steady redistribution of honor and purpose. And through it all I watched them stumble, attempt to bargain, threaten, and finally, in their proudest moments, fail to outmaneuver the moral truth we had built into the structure. They had chosen to be small when the chance to be large was given to them. I chose otherwise. The rest, I knew, would take time to settle,